Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fantastic, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you're joining me for a lovely story tonight. So before we get started, don't forget to go and get yourself that lovely hot cup of cocoa. And don't forget also to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was Christmas Eve in New York City, as Mrs. Paxman sat in the back of the pre-ordered taxi cab, with her two sons, Paul 11 and Bobby 12, looking out the window as the taxi driver drove down Fifth Avenue. The traffic was heavy. The sidewalks were congested with excitable last-minute Christmas shoppers. The atmosphere of the twinkling city, with its sparkling, glittering Christmas lights, was electric, and with the soft light of the late afternoon, early evening, it was washed in a silvery chiffon glaze that only added to the magical ambience. You could see by the ebullient way people were walking around, their arms weighted down with their heavy bags of Christmas parcels, that the holiday buzz was contagious. People and tourists alike were glancing eagerly through shop windows, mesmerized by the cheerful glittering window trim. Many were moving hastily towards the fabled Rockefeller Center to see the not-to-be-missed sensational Christmas tree. The pewter-coloured sky had grown grey, with clouds. The weather forecast was hinting that a white Christmas was on the cards. You could almost feel and smell the presence of snow in the air. It was cold at this time of the year, and New Yorkers were feeling the gusts of a cold breeze beating against their cheeks, as necks were buried behind heavy woolen scarves, and cold icy hands were tucked snugly into fleece-lined leather gloves, while people were wrapped up in puffer jackets and coats. Let's just say the sound of Christmas carols trinkled down the streets. The flashing, twinkling lights of Christmas trees, the glittering accessories that serenaded every shop window, had turned the early breath of the evening into a fairy tale, for there was something so magical about this time of the year. The smell of apple and cinnamon, along with baked ham, seemed to be wafting in the air from a nearby bakery, where people were queuing up to buy fabulous French breads and Christmas fare to take home for Christmas. The smells were so good. You could practically taste the gingerbread and the brandied mincemeat pies. What was there not to like about this grippingly atmospheric time of year? Mrs. Paxman was comfortably seated in the back of the taxi cab, with one son on either side of her. She was very afraid that her husband might not be coming home for Christmas. The thought was just too terrible for words. They had all intended to stay at the cabin that she had booked for her family, in the Adirondack Mountains, 4 hours away from Manhattan, 2 hours south of Montreal. She was crossing her fingers and toes that everything would turn out just fine. But a lingering doubt had descended across her mind, like a looming black thundercloud. Her lips quivered, her fingers twitched. She found herself tapping her feet on the floor. "Stop it," she told herself. "Get a grip, woman. The children will pick up your anxiety. You can't let them see you like this." Bobby sat in the back, next to his mother, his heart heavy with anticipation. They were going to the hospital to pick up their father, but supposing the doctors did not give their father the all-clear for Christmas, then it would mean their dad would not be coming home, and Christmas would not be the same without him. The taxi would wait for them outside the hospital, and if their father did not join them, they'd be taken by their taxi to the Adirondack Mountains, to the cabin that they'd booked. But how could they possibly enjoy themselves without their father being present? Their father would be forced to spend a lonely Christmas without them, stuck in a miserable, mediocre, rather pedestrian hospital ward. Little Bobby Paxman felt a sadness wash over him, as he could see the buzzing people out of the car window, chirruping happily on street corners, some with steaming cups of portable coffee, or fancy lattes in their hands, caught up in the cheerful Christmas vibe. It was so incredibly unfair that Bobby did not share in their enthusiasm that this time of the year would normally engender in him. He clandestinely decided that this was the worst Christmas of his young life. If his dad wasn't going to be with them, Christmas was a washout this year. A total washout. It was so unfair. So unfair, he thought to himself, as tears impertinently bounced out of his eyes and rolled slowly down his cheeks, which he hurriedly wiped away with the back of his sleeve so his mother couldn't see them. What was the matter with him? Big boys didn't cry. "Pull yourself together, Bobby Paxman," he told himself. Mrs. Paxman could see the lugubrious, sorrowful melancholia on her children's faces. She could see how rigid they were, as they sat there in the back seats so stiffly, like two china dolls, almost immune to the cheerful atmosphere of Christmas, like a great big unyielding brick wall. In truth, she knew her crestfallen children were devastated that their dad might not be joining them for Christmas, depending on what Dr. MacFryer had to say. But that doctor was so predictable. She could see him now looking at her through his round glasses that framed his grave, steely eyes, and shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Paxman, but until we've got to the bottom of what is going on with your husband, we simply cannot discharge him." He had said this to her over the last few weeks, again and again, and they were making absolutely no progress in uncovering the enigmatic cause of her husband's baffling illness, despite countless scans, blood tests, and goodness knows what else. Mrs. Paxman's husband had complained of sharp shooting pains in his chest, dizziness, disorientation, fainting spasms, nausea, unexplained weight loss. He had confounded the medical establishment, and no one knew what was going on with him, which was why he'd been kept indefinitely at the hospital, as his rapidly declining health was a cause of grievous concern. For if he continued down this precarious downward trajectory, the prognosis long-term did not look good. Mrs. Paxman had feared the very worst, wondering if her husband had some kind of cancer, but all the tests had come back clear, which meant that some ambiguous, incomprehensible condition was stealing her husband's health with a furtive cunning that had outfoxed all his doctors. Ron Tucker, the taxi driver, seated in the driver's seat, was driving the family to the Adirondack Mountains. Mrs. Paxman had told him to make a swift stop at the hospital to collect the children's father, if the doctor gave him permission to leave the hospital for a few days. Ron glanced very discreetly at the two boys in the back of the taxi, studying their long faces in the visor mirror. They had dark circles under their eyes. His heart went out to them. No kids should look this woebegone and downcast over Christmas. This was his last job of the season, which coincided beautifully with joining his own family at Christmas, whom were all staying in the Adirondack Mountains at his mother's farmhouse. In effect, he was killing two birds with one stone, acquiring this very opportune last-minute job. Ron had two sons at home of similar ages to the two young boys sitting in the back, and when he'd last spoken to them, they had sounded so excited about Christmas. "Dad, when are you coming home?" they had chirruped excitedly. "I've got one more trip to do," he told them. "I'll be seeing you all in time for Christmas morning." "Don't be long, Daddy. Granny's made the best eggnog ever. It's non-alcoholic. It's amazing. It's yummy. And guess what? We've iced the gingerbread house. It looks amazing. We've decorated the Christmas tree in the parlour, and Granny's farmhouse looks fabulous. We've hung our stockings on the mantel and put all the presents under the tree. I've been feeling all the presents, Dad, and I think I know what you and Mum bought me." "Well, you can tell me all about that when I get back. Now, can I speak to your mother, please?" "Hello, sweetheart. As you can hear, the kids are very enthusiastic about you. They're so excited about you coming home. I can't wait to see you myself. It's been snowing here. I know we're going to wake up to a white winter wonderland. It's going to be perfect for Christmas Day. I love a white Christmas. So where are you now at the moment?" "I'm at the hospital at the moment. I'm taking a family to the Adirondack Mountains. They're just checking to see if their father from the hospital can be checked out. So in effect, I'm on my way to you. The job is an added bonus." "Brilliant! Well, drive safely, as I'm sure with the snow expected, it could get treacherous out there." Ron Tucker leans forward in his cab, and his long, slender hands fiddle around with the radio control. Should he put on some Christmas music for these children to listen to? Will it make them feel worse if they hear cheerful, upbeat songs being played? He decided to put on some Christmas carols, but when he glances at the children's faces through the visor mirror, the upbeat, happy music has not lifted the children out of their desolate sadness. They seem pretty convinced their father is not coming home for Christmas, he thinks to himself. As he drives towards the New York Presbyterian Hospital, the mood in his taxi is so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. He can sense the worried atmosphere, which is more apparent to him than the rather tasteless glittering Christmas angel hanging now on his visor mirror. It's Christmas, he thinks to himself, and this low-spirited family is so cast down, so despondent. I wish I could do something to help them, but I'm not God. If he did have any clout with God, he'd give him a big poke in the shoulders and say, "Do something, bro! Fix this mess up! The kids, they need their father!" But Ron knows his relationship with God has been on tenterhooks of late. He can't remember the last time he prayed to the Father, apart from when he wanted the traffic congestion to stop. And when he had prayed, he'd almost thrown his fists up in the air in a tantrum. He had been raging so much. Hardly something that would endear him to his Father in heaven or give him a front row seat to his favour, that was for sure. Finally, Mrs. Paxman's voice breaks the silence. She turns around to address her two children. She hates having this conversation, especially at this time of the year, but it has to be done. She needs to prepare them for disappointment, which she can taste in her mouth as clearly as the bitter coffee she had not enjoyed earlier this morning. It was funny how everything tasted bitter ever since her husband was taken into hospital. She grimaces and bites her quivering lips as she tries to appear nonchalant. The last thing she wants her children to know is how desperately worried she is about their father. Over the last few weeks, his health had really gone down rapidly. She had overheard nurses whispering in the hospital corridors that her husband must have some kind of cancer, even if the tests had all come back negative. Something's going on with Mr. Paxman. But get this, the doctors are vexed. You mark my words, it's cancer. It's got to be. The man is clearly dying. I know a dying patient when I see one. She had winced like a trapped animal, ensnared in a hunter's trap, when she heard what the medical professionals rarely thought about her husband, and it confirmed her worst fears. She also believed her husband was dying, but she'd fight tooth and nail to get him to come to the cabin for Christmas, as he was well enough to travel, not for much longer. This could be his last Christmas, she thought, fighting back a tear that was threatening to spill down her cheeks. "You must not cry," she told herself, "under any circumstances," as if disciplining an insubordinate child. "You cannot let your children see you upset. You hear me, girl? Pull yourself together." Now, we don't know if Daddy is coming home for Christmas or not. It depends what the doctor tells us. I need to warn you that he might not discharge your father if he thinks your dad is too weak to travel. What I'm telling you is, don't get your hopes up. Bobby pulls a face, while his brother remains stoically still, his ashen face desperately trying to hide the sense of panic that is bubbling up inside him. A Christmas without their dad was a dreadful prospect. Mrs. Paxman squeezes her children's hands, both of them sitting on either side of her. "I see no reason why the doctor will not discharge your father. Let's not be defeatist about it until we know what's going on. But I can promise you one thing. I will not leave this hospital tonight without a fight. I'll do my level best to try and persuade the doctor to discharge your dad for a few days. I don't see why they should refuse me." "I don't like that, Mr. Matt Fryer. He's mean to Daddy. If he won't discharge Daddy, he's really horrible. Then he's got no Christmas spirit whatsoever." When Ron parks his taxi outside the hospital and watches the elegant woman with her two sons climbing out of the taxi, his heart almost sinks like a rock being plunged into a deep lake. His heart is bleeding for this family. He can see by Mrs. Paxman's fatigued face and the pinched hollows of her cheeks that this woman has been through hell and back, surfing the waves of despair and hopelessness. He cannot imagine what the family must be going through. He wondered how he'd feel if the doctors could not diagnose his wife. It would drive him completely insane. Mrs. Paxman managed a watery smile that doesn't meet her sorrowful eyes, that are wearing the dark shadows of a sleepless night. She leans inside the taxi to address Ron. "I'm sorry for the hold-up. We won't be very long. I'm just going to check up on my husband, see if he's well enough to come to the cabin. We shouldn't be long. I hope, at least. The doctor needs to talk to us." "You take your time, Mrs. Paxman. There's no rush. And good luck. I hope the doctor will release your husband, but I'll be waiting here for you when you return." Ron watches the family of 3, trailing into the hospital, with reluctant footsteps that tell it all. Their shoulders are hunched, their faces white, and to his surprise a lonely tear slips down his cheek, taking him off guard.
"Where did that come from?" he wondered. "Men like me, we don't cry." "She doesn't believe her husband is going to be released," he thinks. "Poor woman. It seems nonsensical that they haven't been able to figure out what is wrong with the man."
Ron found himself praying for the family.
"Please, God, I realize I'm not a model worshipper. I wish I was, but I'm not like that, I'm afraid. But I have a hell of a lot of faults, I know I do, and I am a sinner. But please let the Paxman children's father come out of hospital for a few days. I beg you. I'm sure the mountain air won't kill him. On the contrary, it might do him the world of good."
Ron realized he was trying to persuade God in his prayer to give the family a break, and he found his prayer became almost defiant and angry.
"I think I'm angry with God," he told himself.
Ron had waited patiently in the taxi, fearing the very worst for the young Paxman family. He was certain they would return to the taxi without their father, but he couldn't have been more wrong about that. Maybe the good Lord had answered his prayer after all. Mrs. Paxman is wheeling her husband towards the taxi in his wheelchair. Ron admits to himself that he doesn't look well. He's emaciated and very frail, more like a man in his 80s than a young man in his 30s. The 2 Paxman boys are standing on either side of the wheelchair, holding the bars. Their feet have almost become like Michael Jackson's dance shoes, as they appear to be skipping. Their former lugubrious expressions have been abandoned, replaced by the biggest smiles he's ever seen. If he didn't know any better, he'd think these children were not the same kids that had been sitting in the taxi only moments before. Mrs. Paxman is wearing a broad grin on her face. She keeps leaning forward in the wheelchair to brush her husband's shoulders and give her husband a reassuring nudge. Ron is sure he's seeing an expression of relief washing over Mr. Paxman's face.
"Poor man," he thinks. "I imagine he's been poked and prodded within an inch of his life from some of the hospital's illustrious doctors, all who cannot agree on what is wrong with the young man."
Once the family reaches the taxi, Ron jumps out of it and helps the heavily sedated Mr. Paxman into the front seat next to him, folding away the wheelchair and tucking it in the back of the trunk. Before long, they're on the road, driving away from the hospital to their destination in the Adirondack Mountains, and Ron feels almost as relieved as the 2 children in the back of the taxi, as he's so pleased that Mr. Paxman will be spending Christmas with his family. He glances at the languid, chronically ill man sitting next to him, who looks like a walking corpse. He draws in a deep breath, and is impelled to pray again.
"God," he says under his breath, "show your mercy to the Paxman family. Give Mr. Paxman a miracle this Christmas. By Jove, he needs one." "I don't understand," said Mr. Paxman. "How did you get the doctor to sign the discharge form for me? I thought that Dr. McFryer would insist I spent a miserable Christmas in hospital, being prodded around and living on hospital slop, feeling as bored as hell, while they decide what they think is going on with me." "I simply told him that enough was enough, that you were in a stable condition. Although you weren't getting better, you weren't getting worse, that it would benefit you to get some fresh mountain air. If they couldn't diagnose your mysterious illness, then they weren't doing their jobs properly. Actually, I'm not sure what I said, but in the end the doctor relented. He said I was absolutely right, that it wouldn't do you any harm to go away for a few days, and in his experience going away might actually boost your morale. He said we should just keep you on your current meds, keep you comfortable and manage your pain, and bring you back to hospital in a week's time for further investigative tests." More tests," Mr. Paxman groaned. "Oh, I can't tell you how many of those I've had. Anyway, let's not talk about bloody hospitals. Let's talk about Christmas, shall we? So tell me about this cabin you booked in the Adirondack Mountains. It sounds quite intriguing."
"Yes, Mummy, tell us about the cabin," her two boys spouted excitedly. "Well, you know old Mrs. Wensleydale, the old woman I told you about."
"I seem to remember you mentioning her," said Mr. Paxman. "She was involved with your school lift club when you were a child, am I not right?"
"That's right. I haven't seen the woman in such an age. She was always bosom buddies with my mother, you know. She used to pick me up from school when I was a girl. I was sitting in a coffee shop about 6 weeks ago, and there she was. Of course she had changed. A full head of white hair, stylish cut around her angular face, twinkling blue eyes, and a very elegant appearance. She was always very elegant. She's always been well presented, you know, dressing in classical tweed skirts and jackets. You know the kind of thing. Well, she trotted over to me and said, 'Excuse me for staring, dear, but you do look awfully familiar. I hate it when I see a face and I can't put a name to it. Where do I know you from? Could you put me out of my misery? Because I'm really suffering here. And if I hate anything, it's not getting to the bottom of a mystery. I know we've crossed paths before, but I cannot think where or when.' You also look familiar, but I honestly can't think what it is. Maybe it's your eyes, your jawline, I'm not sure. My name is Irma Paxman, if that rings any bells for you." She shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know any Paxmans, but I do remember an Irma. You're not Irma Thornfield, are you?" "I was her, before I married my husband, of course. I'm now Paxman, but I was Thornfield." "Oh, my word, dear, that is good news. Don't you remember me? Silly me. I've probably aged so much over the years that you barely recognised me. I'm Mrs. Wensleydale. Do you remember? I was very good friends with your mother. I used to pick you up from school when you were a little girl. Oh, those were the days, weren't they? You were such a chatty little thing in my lift club, garrulously talking away about everything. You were quite the pleasure to collect from school. Most of the kids weren't like you. They never told us anything. Nothing about their day at all. But you would tell us everything. You were quite delightful." "Oh, my goodness, Mrs. Wensleydale, I recognise you. Yes, I'm sorry it's been so long." "Well, you've grown up, haven't you, into a fine, very remarkable young woman. I knew you would. May I be so bold and presumptuous to ask you if you'd be free to join me for some coffee? I'd love to catch up with you." "That would be wonderful," I said. So we got talking. I told her everything. I told her about your dad being in hospital with a mysterious illness which the doctors could not diagnose. She was naturally very appalled. "You mean he's only 35 and they don't know what's wrong with him? Honestly, I'm quite confounded about that. And I thought medicine had advanced these days. That really does suck. You know, I had a good friend like that, whom the doctors failed to diagnose, until they seemed to agree that she had Lyme's disease of all things. She was sick for an incredibly long period of time. It took them an age to get a diagnosis. I mean, we're talking about months, not just weeks. I think she's a lot better these days. So tell me, is your husband coming out of hospital for Christmas, I hope?" "I hope so," I said. "Normally we go away for Christmas every year, but everything's so booked up at the moment. We're possibly going to have to stay in our Manhattan apartment." "No, that absolutely will not do. Now I've got the perfect place for you," says Mrs. Wensleydale. "My daughter has some luxury cabins in the Adirondack Mountains, not too far from here. They're quite stunning, and I mean stunning. I went to stay there once and I wallowed in the lap of luxury. She had kitted those cabins out luxuriously, thought of everything you could possibly think of. She told me she had a cancellation on one of the cabins, fully paid up.
The couple chose to go to their family in Florida for Christmas at the very last minute. They suddenly changed their itinerary. So I hasten to say, there is one cabin going free, and it's all yours if you want it. I can give her a call if you like. It's only 4 hours away from Manhattan. Terribly convenient location-wise. Still New York. The views, oh my word, they're sensational. The cabins are magnificently, perfectly kitted out, with a freezer and refrigerator simply packed with Christmas food. So you don't even have to go food shopping for a single thing. Everything you could possibly think of is there, from your Christmas crackers to the pre-decorated Christmas tree. But you will need to do cooking on the big day, of course. The previous guests, as I said, paid for the cabin in advance, so we won't charge you a bean. So don't you dare look a gift horse in the mouth. Free Christmas cabins with all expenses paid don't grow on trees. Believe me, I know. It sounds wonderful, but how can I possibly accept that? I mean, that's just incredibly generous. But I do enjoy doing the Christmas cooking, so I won't be complaining about that. Don't talk nonsense, dear. Your family has been through hell. You deserve some good luck for a change. So you are interested, I take it. Absolutely. If you're sure, I'd love to take you up on your offer. If the cabin is available, of course, unless your daughter's given it to someone else. I doubt that very much, says Mrs. Wensleydale, pulling out her elegant leather bag, placing it on the table. She brought out her cell phone and called her daughter. Krista, it's me. Yes, your mother. You remember you told me one of the cabins was going free for the holidays? Is it still available? Oh, good, I thought so. No, I'm phoning, as by random chance I bumped into a very good old friend of ours. You might remember her. She was in your lift club at school a couple of years ahead of you, I think. Irma Thornfield, the girl that liked to talk a lot. That's right. When Mrs. Wensleydale finished talking to her daughter, she said, My daughter says she could never ever forget you. She sends you so much love. The good news is the cabin is available for you and your family. They're usually booked months in advance, you know. They don't even advertise on the internet. People learn about the cabins from friends and the word gets out like wildfire. So there you are. Now you know how I got us a cabin in the Adirondack Mountains. Well, you did well, sweetheart. With these extraordinary hospital fees, we could do well with some free accommodation. What a stroke of luck. I know a break to the mountains is what the doctor ordered. Not literally, of course. I'm already feeling a lot perkier, just getting away from that nondescript beige environment. But I feel quite woozy. They sedated me rather heavily. Good. I think that's a good thing that they did that. It possibly will make the trip more comfortable for you. Try and get some sleep, will you? As Ron drove his taxi through the night, he was familiar where he was going, for he had made the journey to this part of the world regularly, and was well acquainted with all the secondary roads here, so he knew he was unlikely to get lost. He glanced at the clock. It was 6 o'clock. If they made good timing, they could be at their destination by 10:30, if the traffic was good. The world beyond his window was dark, but the silvery light of the moon reduced its intimidation exponentially. It began to snow, as large flecks of white dropped from the sky, like floating butterflies laying their flecks on the ground, one on top of the other. Bobby knew that once they woke up in the cabin on Christmas morning, there'd be snow everywhere. He was happy about that. He always felt desperately sorry for folks living in hot countries around the world at Christmas time, because it was a time of the year that demanded cold weather as a prerequisite for that cosy atmosphere that only winter could orchestrate. Crackling fires, piping hot Christmas turkey, crispy potatoes, and Christmas pudding served with oodles of brandy custard. When they had got into the taxi and driven to the hospital, Bobby had been certain their father would not be joining them for Christmas, and had been fully prepared to be bitterly disappointed. It had worried Bobby that something was dreadfully wrong with his father, and he was as frustrated as his mother was that the doctors were not able to diagnose his father's unfathomable foligenous condition. Bobby thought his father looked weak, very frail, and his dramatic weight loss was seriously worrying. The good news was that their dad would be joining them. It was a dream come true, he thought, given the hospital's rigidly stiff policies. But there was a nagging feeling that tormented little Bobby, tangling his guts into a plethora of knots. It was an elephant in the room he was afraid to discuss. Bobby could not shake the ominous, nonsensical feeling off, that this may well be the last Christmas they might get to enjoy with their father. He grimaced secretly, scolding himself for such defeatist, gloom-ridden musings. "Don't think like that, Bobby. Stop being so pessimistic. Your dad is here now. That's all that matters. You're going to have a wonderful Christmas with your father. Don't think about tomorrow. Think of today and cherish what time you have left with your dad, even if it is only fleeting." Bobby wondered if Paul and his mother nursed similar fatalistic, unfavourable opinions that he daren't articulate, as the monumental words could bring the world as they knew it crashing down. There was no doubt in his mind that ignorance was not bliss. Being uninformed was literally torture, and it's the not knowing that the seeds of nightmares can be propagated, and the ground can bring forth unexpected barbs, briars, and weeds that may catch you unaware and strike you down with their fortuitous cutting jabs. Even if he knew his father had a deadly cancer, at least they would know where they were. But being clueless about their dad's condition meant the whole family was stumbling around in the darkness, looking for the light and failing to ever find it. "Are you all right, Bobby?" his mother whispered to him in the back of the taxi, giving his hands a tight, encouraging squeeze. "What are you thinking about? You look as if you're miles away." "I'm glad Daddy is spending Christmas with us, that's all," said Bobby. "Really glad." "So am I," whispered his mother. "We're going to enjoy every minute, aren't we? We're going to make this the best Christmas ever. The good news is the cabin is filled with all the Christmas trimmings, and so all I need to do is the cooking in the morning. Isn't that wonderful? Everything is prepared for us." "It is," said Bobby. "It really is. And you're a great cook, Mum." Bobby had been falling asleep in the taxi. It was a comforting sound of the wheels humming across the winding roads and the sense of the snow falling soundlessly on the ground outside the taxi. But the more snow that began to fall, the more banging and buckling sounds could be heard around the taxi, as if a piston was going to come through the hood of the car. Ironically, the jerking, rocking movements of the taxi seemed to bring on the yawns, and an insatiable tiredness that meant that Bobby's eyelids began to become heavy. He surrendered to the serene persuasion of a fitful sleep. It helped that they were covered in blankets while listening to the sounds of Christmas carols, trilling through the night. Occasionally he would smudge his nose against the cold misty pane of the window and peer outside. There were no trucks on the road anymore. They had left the busy traffic behind them. There was snow on the sides of the road. The trees looked so dark, their tall, tenebrous silhouettes all but a murky shadow in the background. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and it's a very exciting story. You're going to just love it, so don't miss out on it. Until next time, goodbye and good night.